Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Battle of Actium by Historia Civilis. So, last time, even though I reacted to them out of order, chronologically the last video in the series was War and Peace and War. So make sure to watch that one before you get to this one. In that video, we basically saw tensions building between Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian revealed Mark Antony's secret will, and he basically framed it as Mark Antony turning his back on Rome and going towards Egypt instead. And there was actually some truth to that. Through that, he convinced the remaining senators to go to war with Cleopatra, though of course that would entail war with Mark Antony. So, presumably in this video, we're moving into the next civil war, this one between Octavian and Mark Antony. I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, another civil war. Jeez, Rome.
In 31 B.C.E., Octavian began his third year as consul. Octavian and Antony had intended to share power this year as a public display of unity, but
they had shared power before we saw the formation of the Second Triumvirate, at which time Octavian was actually the junior partner, and really I think the biggest change since then is that Octavian has continued to get more and more powerful. He began as the junior figure amongst Mark Antony, Lepidus, and himself Octavian, but over time he's grown more and more powerful, outstripping Lepidus, and in fact putting Lepidus into a forced retirement, and now he's probably in a stronger position than Mark Antony is. So I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that Octavian has really built up his position, and now feels like he's powerful enough to take on Mark Antony, because if you guys remember, Caesar chose Octavian to inherit his legacy. Octavian was his posthumously adopted son. And so I'm sure Octavian feels like he deserves to fully inherit that legacy, not share it with his adopted father's old right-hand man. What right does Mark Antony have? And so we've been getting closer and closer to that point of conflict as Octavian gets more powerful, and the interests of Mark Antony and Octavian begin to clash with each other.
But instead, the two were at war. To their credit, Antony and Cleopatra possessed the foresight to see that war was coming.
Yeah, and I will say, and we talked about this in War and Peace, but the Roman state has been at almost constant war with itself for a long time. You know, a lot of these soldiers have been fighting for years and years. Roman citizens, their quality of life has declined, their political system is crumbling, and they just see constant infighting amongst Romans. I feel like if you're a Roman at this point, it would probably be a pretty reasonable assumption to think that either this fighting was just going to continue forever, or it was going to continue until Rome itself completely collapsed. Now, of course, from our perspective, we know that's not going to happen. In fact, once Octavian beats Mark Antony, finishes him off, there will be an impressive period of stability under the new Emperor Augustus, Octavian. But at the time, that would be very hard to imagine, I think.
And had spent much of the previous year moving armies into Greece. This was where Antony intended to make a stand. Critics of Antony have long said Pompey made his stand in Greece and failed. Brutus and Cassius made their stand in Greece and also failed.
I mean, it seems like the natural place to make a stand. It is sort of the center of the Roman East, though we've seen Mark Antony trying to move the center of the Roman East away from Greece and towards Egypt. I think Greece still holds that position. It's a prosperous area. There's a lot of resources. You probably have a lot of allies there. You can gather up a lot of legions. I think it makes sense why these guys continually make their final stand or, set up their base of operations in Greece, though, if asked, you might think that Mark Antony would do it in Egypt, since he's been so Egypt-oriented, but, he went for the classic Greece strategy, which, as Historia Civilis is pointing out, has so far failed twice.
Why on earth would Antony try the same failed strategy for the third time in a row? Antony's reasoning, and I actually agree with him here, was that if he marched into Italy with a significant number of Egyptians and other Eastern allies, it would be construed by the Romans as a foreign army.
And I think that's a very good point, because what we've seen in these last couple of episodes is as Octavian grows in popularity, one of the ways he's managing to turn the Roman people and the Roman Senate against Mark Antony is to frame him as a foreigner. You know, he's abandoning Rome for Egypt. You know, he's entranced with Cleopatra, this foreign monarch. Antony is so obsessed with Egypt that he's forgetting about Rome. And Octavian's ran this pretty successful PR campaign to reframe Mark Antony. And so I think Antony is kind of right. He would only be reinforcing that if he invaded the Italian peninsula with a bunch of Egyptians and foreign allies. That is certainly not going to play well with the Roman public.
When faced with what they would perceive to be a foreign invasion, all of Italy would unite behind Octavian.
And, I mean, we saw last time that the Roman Senate, now a third of the Roman Senate fled to go join Antony, but the remaining Senate, they didn't declare war on Mark Antony, they declared war on Cleopatra. So they are very focused on this idea of a foreign threat or this Egyptian ploy to take over Roman power. So I do also understand where Mark Antony is coming from.
Antony's analysis was that he had to defeat Octavian abroad so that he could leave the foreigners behind and walk into Italy with a 100% Roman army. So, Antony now had to decide where to fight. In the east, Greece was probably the best when it came to military recruitment.
It's sort of interesting to remember, and I will remind you, if we look at the map that was just on screen, and you can see it a little bit now, the light pink territory is Antony's, and Egypt is colored a different color because it was sort of its own autonomous thing. The dark purpley pink is Octavian, and the Italian peninsula, which is colored in red, is supposed to be neutral territory. Does anybody remember that? Because since Octavian and Mark Antony made that agreement, Italy has basically been Octavian's territory. I mean, Antony has been stationed in the east, Octavian has been stationed in Rome, and this whole time he's been operating, in Rome, in the Italian peninsula, building his base of support there, building his popularity there. So not for a second was Italy actual neutral territory. It basically always belonged to Octavian, and, given the power base he's built and the fact that a third of the Senate fled to go join Antony, now Italy is definitely under Octavian's control, and Octavian has a strong position. He's managed to gain more territory throughout the Second Triumvirate. He built up his position, he negotiated with Mark Antony, so his territory goes pretty far east. He holds the Italian peninsula, and he holds the territory that Lepidus once held, versus Antony, who seems to have only grown weaker over time, though he is still a formidable foe.
It also didn't hurt that Antony was quite personally popular in the region. All things considered, fighting in Greece for the third time in a row actually made a lot of sense. As Antony slowly moved his armies over to Greece, he set up a bunch of outposts and spent the better part of a year recruiting locally as fast as he could.
I mean, look, it does look bad to do the same thing that's been tried and failed twice, but every situation is unique. And though comparisons to the past are certainly crucial, and you should keep them in mind, your situation might be different. And I'm sure Mark Antony knows that. He's doing that mental calculus. He's saying, I know the Greece strategy has failed twice before, but I'm in a different position. I have different strengths, different weaknesses, and for me, this is the best option. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I'm not sure what would have happened if he had used his foreign and Egyptian allies to invade the Italian peninsula instead, but I do understand his concerns.
One issue complicating things was supplies. Antony was supplying his armies all the way from Egypt, meaning that he had a constant flow of ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean. If he ever wanted to cross to Italy, he would have to use those ships to do so. meaning that he would have to stop the grain transport for potentially months. If he made the crossing without any food, he would be forced into the position of plundering Roman cities at the head of a foreign army.
Oh, and this is something that Caesar specifically tried to avoid doing. I mean, if you're talking about Gallic cities, Caesar burned many of them, plundered them, sold the civilians into slavery. But when Caesar was dealing with Roman territory and Roman citizens, he always tried to be gentle and merciful. So no plundering cities, no looting, because that looks very bad. A Roman general looting Roman cities? Hey, if you want to lead Rome after this, then you're not going to be very popular. Obviously, Mark Antony also has this in mind, so that would be forcing himself into a dangerous position, at least in terms of his popularity. And this is no regular war, this is a civil war. Part of that is building support amongst the people, amongst the locals, the politicians, the army even. A big part of this is staying popular and convincing people that you are the better option compared to your opponent.
That's a good look. With all of this in mind, Antony set up on the western coast of Greece. He had naval superiority over Octavian, so his plan for the near term was to sit back and force Octavian to make the extremely risky crossing over to Greece.
Uh-oh. Great music.
Back in Italy, Octavian's right-hand man Agrippa was devising his own strategy.
Woo, Agrippa.
He gathered some of...
Yeah, honestly, just leave it up to Agrippa. We've seen Agrippa emerge in the past couple of episodes, and I'm a big Agrippa fan. Agrippa and Octavian are a great pair. And you can definitely say, without Agrippa, Octavian would have been in a lot of trouble in many different situations. So whenever you hear that little zoomy noise that Historia Civilis puts alongside Agrippa, you know there's probably something good coming.
Of Octavian's best ships into a small fleet on the southern coast of Italy, and hand-picked sailors to crew them who had experience on both the Illyricum campaign and the campaign against the boat king Sextus.
And we saw that even though the Romans have traditionally not been super great at naval warfare, Agrippa actually overperformed in the naval theater of the war against Sextus Pompeius. So, of any Roman, he's probably the most qualified to man this sort of fleet.
When they were ready, they sailed off blindly into open water, with nothing to guide them but the sun and the stars.
Jeez, okay.
After 3 or 4 days of sailing, they caught sight of land.
I always gotta say, particularly with the newer videos, Historia Civilis has improved so much over the years. Just the fantastic editing, the fantastic storytelling, the music choices, really just all of it. He really knows how to present this information and tell a story that is incredibly engaging. Alright, I just had to gush for a little bit over the quality of our boys' videos, because they're just fantastic.
It was the naval base of Methone, currently under Antony's control. After days in the open sea, with no navigational tools beyond their own eyeballs, they hit their target exactly.
Wow.
The Romans were poor sailors, and preferred to follow the coastline whenever possible. They were capable of sailing in the open water, but they always had to be prepared to arrive hundreds of kilometers off course. This is why the Lighthouse of Alexandria existed. Incoming ships were often coming in after several days in the open water, with no earthly idea where they were.
Well, for most of human history, sailing in the open water was, 1, very scary, and 2, very dangerous, particularly if you didn't know where you were going. Now, you might look at the Eastern Mediterranean today and say, well, that's not a long way to go. Trust me, if you don't know where you're going, you don't have accurate naval charts and maps, you don't have the skills, you could have a hard time ending up where you want to end up. I think of, for example, the Age of Exploration in Europe, a long time after this, of course, but, guys like Columbus. Now, he ended up somewhere he very much did not expect. He didn't actually know where he was going in reality, but sailing out into the open ocean, basically no idea of how long it's going to take you or where exactly you're going to end up. That's a pretty scary thing, and that's kind of how it was for, like I said, most of human history.
Agrippa was one of the few Roman generals with actual naval experience.
Wow.
And with the help of the best and the brightest in the Roman Navy, he was able to execute this maneuver with pinpoint precision.
Very impressive.
Agrippa quickly besieged and then captured the base at Methone.
Wow. A successful Roman naval assault. How incredibly rare.
What was the point of all this? Remember what I said about Antony supplying himself all the way from Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
Think about it. Think about it. Methone was the perfect base from which to intercept those ships. The attack on Methone was a high-risk, high-reward operation.
And, we saw, a couple videos ago, Octavian got most of his grain from Sicily. And the whole strategy of Sextus Pompeius, the boat king, was to capture Sicily, a couple other islands, and then cut them off from the Italian peninsula. And that was incredibly destructive to Italy as a whole and Octavian's position. So now Octavian gets a shot at cutting off Antony's line of supply, doing something very similar.
But it came off perfectly. And now, Agrippa and a tiny fleet were behind Antony's lines, wreaking havoc on his supply ships. Pretty soon, Agrippa began to escalate his attacks by storming a bunch of lightly defended bases along the coast.
Okay. Very dangerous for Antony.
Just as Antony was beginning to realize what was happening to the south, Octavian launched his own surprise attack in the north.
Wow.
He crossed into Greece quite a bit earlier in the year than Antony had been expecting. Quite a bit further north than Antony had been expecting as well. This whole strategy was the brainchild of Agrippa, and it was another combined land-sea assault.
Well, honestly, if we're seeing any military strategy from Octavian, particularly any brilliant military strategy, you can probably bet that it's the brainchild of Agrippa. We've talked about this before. I think Historia Civilis is often needlessly negative about Octavian, but military affairs were absolutely not his thing. And that's why he had Agrippa, because military affairs were very much Agrippa's thing. He was extremely talented. That's why they're such a good combo.
Let me reiterate that the Romans did not think like this. Agrippa had a particular talent for these kinds of combined attacks, and he had Antony's head spinning. He was now backed into a position where he either had to march south or march north, and with either choice, he would be making a major concession to the enemy. He chose to march north to face Octavian. As a consequence of this choice, Agrippa's fleet picked up the pace, intercepting and capturing more and more of Antony's ships coming from Egypt. Octavian marched south until he reached the town of Actium, at which time he occupied a hill on the north side of the strait and waited.
Now, I will say, just in terms of the leadership, I would also choose to take on Octavian instead of Agrippa. He is definitely the easier foe, but of course the trade-off is that now Agrippa has almost full control over your supply lines. He can intercept all of these ships coming in, and so Antony's in a bad position. As Historia Civilis presented it, Agrippa was brilliant with these, at the time, very unconventional strategies, and so Antony felt like he only had two options, and either way, he would lose something. And so he decided to go for Octavian, which is probably the better option, but there's still that negative consequence of giving Agrippa free rein to attack your incoming supplies. So, very intelligent from Agrippa.
By the spring, Antony had gathered his army and initiated a bunch of minor attacks that were intended to push Octavian off that hill, but none of them worked. Around this time, Octavian and Agrippa met up to revise their strategy.
Good.
And
There's Agrippa. I'm feeling a lot more confident for Octavian now.
by their strategy, I mean Agrippa's strategy.
Yeah.
The naval operation to the south was going a lot better than expected. They were capturing a crazy number of Egyptian grain ships, and it seemed that Antony was more or less powerless to do anything about it. Their fleet was slowly growing, while Antony's was slowly shrinking.
Wow.
The two agreed that they were so well positioned that they could afford to play the waiting game. If Antony wanted to attack their defensive hilltop position, let him.
Yeah, I mean, if you have control of your enemy's supply line, your fleet is growing, theirs is shrinking, Antony is, probably losing supplies by the day, and over time he's going to need those supplies more and more. If that's the position you're in, then I don't think it's a bad idea to stall, force Antony to make the move, because Antony basically baited them into making the first move. Octavian and Agrippa, they're the ones who came from Italy over to Greece, but now they're in the position where they can try and wait him out. So I think that's probably a good idea.
Otherwise, do nothing. Over the summer, Antony tried to cut off Octavian's access to fresh water, but he failed every time. Later in the summer, Agrippa's supply disruptions to the south started to have their intended effect. Antony was forced to cut rations.
Ooh.
Some of Antony's eastern allies were growing increasingly alarmed at his conduct of the war, and took this opportunity to slip away with their armies.
Damn.
Antony was livid, but
And this is one of the issues with having these foreign allies, is that they may be less devoted to the cause than your own men. Though, in a civil war like this, where it's Roman against Roman, if stuff starts going badly enough, you can guess that also your own men, even if they are Roman, will probably start deserting the cause eventually. But particularly foreign allies who have less of a stake in the outcome of this battle, it just makes sense for them to get the hell out of there. They're saying, yeah, this is not going well. I think we'd be better off leaving and just working out a negotiation with whoever wins this battle, whether it be Antony or Octavian.
but he wasn't in a position to stop them. By August, Agrippa's fleet had so many extra ships that he was able to just openly sit offshore and intercept any Egyptian grain ships that had escaped his patrols elsewhere.
Wow.
Antony's fleet was reduced to hiding in the strait. Antony decided that he needed at least a couple of supply ships to get through if he was to continue the fight. He decided to break the blockade. He waited for a foggy morning and launched a surprise attack. As Antony's ships left the strait, they encountered some small ships, which immediately turned and fled. Antony was encouraged by this and gave chase through the fog.
I would be careful. That could be a good sign. It could also be a sign that Agrippa's fleet knows what it's doing and is pulling back so that they can assault Antony's fleet with a larger number of their own ships. I don't know which way this is going, but I would certainly be cautious if I was Antony's fleet.
Minutes later, he stumbled across the bulk of Agrippa's blockade fleet.
There it is.
Much larger ships, who immediately turned and attacked.
Damn.
Antony's fleet was forced to turn and flee back into the strait, and we're told that casualties were quite heavy. Either Agrippa was able to successfully bait Antony out into the open water, or it was just a happy accident. Either way, it was impressive seamanship converging on Antony in the fog like that.
Yeah, a rare Roman naval battle, first off. They try to avoid those. And a rare, impressive naval victory, though it was against fellow Romans. So maybe take that into consideration. I really think it could have been either one. It could have been an accident, or you could certainly imagine this being part of Agrippa's plan. It does seem more likely that it was an accident, but if it was, like you said, that is still impressive seamanship from the Romans. I mean, clearly Agrippa's fleet knows what it's doing. He certainly does. He has some experience. Some of his men have experience. And this is pretty rare, like we've mentioned, for Roman soldiers.
no other living Roman would have had the skill or the foresight to manage a fleet like this.
Yeah, that's true.
After this defeat, the senators...
You said no other living because, well, of course there were Romans in the past that could have, but the recently deceased Sextus Pompeius probably could have handled a fleet of this size, but, he is now gone, defeated by Agrippa and Octavian.
in Antony's camp began to lose their nerve and make their way back to Octavian. Late in August, Antony met with his advisors. They were completely out of food. He told them that they could not stay here any longer. They had to withdraw from Actium. Some advisors urged Antony to withdraw north into Macedonia. They recommended regrouping, yielding the seas to Octavian, and seeking a decisive battle on land. Many of Antony's grizzled Roman veterans were in this camp. Others urged Antony to seek a decisive battle at sea.
Really?
Cleopatra and many of the remaining Eastern allies were in this camp. They argued that despite their earlier losses, they still had a strong and experienced fleet. If they yielded the sea, the whole fleet would be squandered. Why not?
I mean, this is true, but a sea battle against Agrippa's fleet? This seems incredibly risky and perhaps foolish. I really don't know if that's a good idea.
Use it and see if they could make something happen. Antony decided to fight at sea. Some have said that this decision was unduly swayed by Cleopatra, but under the circumstances and given the options, I think it was the right call. The plan to flee inland with no food, the plan sucked. The only people calling for it were a few Roman generals who thought that naval warfare was beneath them.
I guess, but I don't like the other plan either, frankly, and I don't know, I just feel like we're talking about a Roman army here. They always have a better chance on land. I feel like they might have a better chance trying to fight their way out of the situation on land rather than trying to fight and escape on sea. Maybe I'm wrong. These both seem like pretty tough options to go with, but I think it's a real risky move to try and fight against Agrippa's fleet, considering the situation they're already in. I guess we'll see what happens.
If Antony had yielded the seas to Octavian, he would have been stuck in Greece with a dwindling army and no further support from Egypt or the East.
This is true. I guess you do also have to consider Antony's base of operations that has been weakened over time in comparison to Octavian. If you look at the position he's in, Historia Civilis is right that he would be trapped in Greece. He controls the Roman East, and sort of the most powerful regions he would be cut off from. He would have access to Greece, but with the dwindling supplies, how much is that going to be worth? More importantly, he wouldn't have access to Egypt and its resources, and that was supposed to be sort of a main part of Antony's military strategy. So I do understand those considerations. You do have to keep those in mind.
It was not a serious plan. If they fought at sea, there was at least a chance of victory.
All right, fair enough. I guess if you're framing it like that, Antony is already in an incredibly desperate do-or-die situation. I honestly didn't realize it had devolved this quickly. And in that situation, yeah, maybe going to sea would be the better option. I just can't help but think back on Caesar. And, Caesar never would have taken to sea. Maybe in this situation he would have, but, I just imagine all the time Caesar was trapped somewhere or trapped in enemy territory and then campaigned his way out of it. I know this is a different situation, of course, but, I'm always thinking back on Caesar and his exploits. So the whole, scarper away and escape by sea, it seems a little un-Roman. But maybe that's probably the foolish attitude that some of those generals had, who wanted to just, move northwards and fight their way out, which probably would have ended even worse. So I do understand the arguments being made.
And if not that, at least a chance to fight another day. Maybe there's a hidden third option that they should have considered, but I can't think of it.
Well, I guess, hey, you can say that the plan of Octavian and mainly Agrippa has certainly worked. Antony wanted them to make the first move. He wanted them to leave their base of support in Italy and come to Greece. They did, and they have completely outmaneuvered him to a pretty high degree.
Let me just sidebar here for a second. Antony had begun this campaign in an overwhelmingly strong position. There had been basically no fighting over the summer. Skirmishes, one minor battle at sea, but nothing serious. Now, Antony was leaving Actium with his tail between his legs, hoping that maybe the whole thing would come out as a draw. This was all Agrippa's doing. He had won the battle without firing a shot.
Yeah.
Not literally, but, metaphorically. This was all positioning and logistics and coordination between land and sea operations.
Yeah, well, we talked about in these last couple of episodes, particularly with Agrippa's campaign in Illyricum, he had a very, at the time, unconventional way of doing things, and I think what we would see as a modern way of doing things. Positioning, logistics, coordination between land and sea. These are some of the things that will become extremely important in modern military strategy over the last couple hundred years, from what I'm looking at. So Agrippa really bringing these things into practice during this time period and clearly baffling Mark Antony and his men. It's really extremely impressive. And clearly Agrippa was able to think outside the box and use these strategies that were very unconventional and very irregular. So yeah, just incredibly impressive.
Things that Antony didn't really pay attention to. Things that most Roman generals didn't really pay attention to.
Yeah.
But they're the things that win wars.
I mean, look, we can look at Caesar. Caesar was very talented at military affairs, but I would probably say that logistics was not his strong suit. He was always forgetting to secure a supply line or losing his supply line, or he would end up deep, stranded within enemy territory, and that led to a lot of his finest, most impressive moments, which is great. I'm glad we have those stories, but clearly I think Caesar was weak in this area as well. Most Roman generals were, and I always appreciate someone who really looks at positioning and logistics, because I think those things are incredibly underappreciated in warfare. Even in modern warfare, where logistics have become really, really important, I still think when we're looking at more modern history, the Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars, the American Civil War, I still think logistics are underappreciated by most people. Because they might not be as flashy as big battles, for example, but they are incredibly, incredibly important and really crucial to winning a campaign, winning a war.
During this time, he crewed up as many ships as he could, and burned the ones that he could not use for battle. We are told that during this week, there was some kind of covert attempt to kidnap Antony, and that it was almost friggin' successful.
Wow.
Sadly, that's all we know about this incident. But if somebody wants to take that one sentence from Plutarch and turn it into a dang movie, I would watch it.
Yeah, that would be a great movie or historical fiction novel. I mean, a lot of the stuff we've seen in Historia Civilis videos would make for fantastic movies or historical fiction novels.
On September 2nd of 31 BCE, Antony attempted to break Agrippa's blockade. So he arrayed his ships in a crescent formation near the shore and waited. He held many of the Egyptian ships, including Cleopatra's flagship, in reserve. By this time, Agrippa had captured so many Egyptian ships that his fleet outnumbered Antony's. But many of these ships were big, bulky things that were designed as cargo transports, not ideal for battle. Antony's fleet, on the other hand, mostly consisted of state-of-the-art warships.
Okay, so despite Agrippa's experience and knowledge, seems like Antony's fleet is still better suited for this kind of all-out battle than Agrippa's fleet is. So maybe he has more of a chance than I thought. I mean, to be honest, with Agrippa seizing all of these Egyptian ships and Antony's fleet hiding in the harbor, I got the impression that Antony's fleet was very much weakened. But it seems like it still has a fair level of strength.
Agrippa had the quantity, Antony had the quality. Accordingly, Agrippa's strategy was to lure Antony out into the open water so that he could overwhelm him with superior numbers.
Yep.
Antony's strategy was to lure Agrippa towards the mouth of the strait so that his state-of-the-art ships could dominate the space.
All right, Antony does know what he's doing. To be honest, when we were first going over the options Antony had, I basically thought he was totally screwed. But seeing the description of this battle, both sides, what each side plans to do, I do now think Antony has far more of a chance than I thought he did. Still, he's in a very tricky position, a very dangerous position, but he certainly has an opportunity here to defeat Agrippa's fleet and reposition, away from Greece, probably back to Egypt, reposition where his base of supplies are and all of his resources, and recommence the campaign on maybe a stronger foot. Though, that would be the best case scenario, to be honest. Even then, Octavian and Agrippa would still have won the first phase of this civil war and would be overall holding an advantage, I think.
Antony commanded from the right flank because he knew that's where most of the action would be. Agrippa commanded opposite him. Octavian watched from a distance.
Yep.
Both sides loaded their ships with soldiers, knowing full well that once the ships made contact with each other, the whole thing would devolve into hand-to-hand combat. Agrippa could fit 40,000 soldiers onto his bulky transports, while Antony could only fit 20,000 on his warships.
I mean, that's a massive discrepancy, but, we're at sea, so those 40,000 soldiers aren't going to matter if they can't board the enemy ships, right? So, Antony is technically outnumbered in terms of manpower 2-1, but I think that's less important than it might appear on the surface.
The remaining armies could do nothing but watch helplessly from land. Antony ordered his 50,000 remaining soldiers to escape east if possible, no matter the result of the coming battle.
Okay.
Each fleet wanted the other to attack first. There was a standoff that dragged on all morning.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. We've described their strategies. Both want to lure the other one in. But the whole reason this is happening is because Antony cannot afford to wait. His supplies are cut off. His men are going to starve eventually. If not soon, he has to do something. So he can not afford to wait. Octavian can definitely afford to wait longer. Though in a standoff like this, either side could flinch. So I'm not sure who's going to act first.
Antony was the one who actually needed this battle to happen, so
Yeah.
it fell to him to initiate.
Exactly.
Around midday, Antony ordered the ships on his right forward. Agrippa's ships responded by rowing backward to lure Antony's ships into the open water.
I mean, if Agrippa can execute his strategy to a T, then I think Antony's in a lot of trouble because he needs to draw Agrippa in. And he also needs this battle to happen so that he can escape and get his resources. If Agrippa keeps backpedaling and luring Antony in, whether or not Antony's men decide to engage, if they do, they'll get swarmed. If they don't, then they're just wasting more time. So I think Antony, he's in a tricky position.
Other ships saw this activity happening and began to push forward. Within minutes, there was activity all along the line, and according to Plutarch, it took on the character of a land battle.
How very Roman of them.
After 2 or 3 hours of fighting, Antony's overextended right began to run into trouble. He diverted ships from the center to reinforce. Sensing Antony's weakness, Agrippa did the same.
Ooh.
It was at this time when Cleopatra's ships that were standing in reserve sprang into action.
Okay.
As one, all 70 or 80 ships belonging to Cleopatra raised sails and made a beeline for the weakened center of the battle. But they weren't moving in to help.
They're trying to run away. Is that what he's saying?
They were making a run for it.
I can't say I'm that surprised.
Most of the other ships had prepared for battle by either taking their sails down or totally dismantling them and leaving them on shore to make room for extra soldiers.
Wow.
Once Cleopatra's ships got moving and were through the sporadic fighting in the center, there was no stopping them.
Look, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, even though Egypt is in some ways a client kingdom of Rome, they had this Egyptian-Roman partnership under Antony. It has a certain level of autonomy, right? It has its own territory. And, frankly, that partnership with Antony had elevated Egypt above the point it was already at. So Cleopatra has her own interests to worry about, and I imagine that's what she's thinking about in this whole business. And she's saying, yeah, you know what? I don't need to stay here, fight this battle, and die with Mark Antony, potentially. What I need to do is get back to my kingdom and tend to its interests, which I would imagine she holds above both Roman interests and the interests of Mark Antony. That's what I think would be going through her head. I don't really know. Maybe there were some other considerations. I'm sure this is something we can never truly know. But if those are the considerations that she's thinking of, then, it makes sense.
Seeing what was happening, Antony literally jumped ship and swam for a smaller, faster vessel.
Wow.
He rallied about 40 ships of his own and followed Cleopatra out of the battle.
Okay, interesting. So this basically went... I'm not sure how it's going to end yet, but so far it's basically gone as I expected. In the battle, Agrippa got the upper hand, and Antony/Cleopatra, they've taken this opportunity to flee. So this is kind of going the way I expected. Worst case scenario would have been Antony being completely defeated and potentially killed. Best case would have been him winning this naval battle, but that seemed pretty unrealistic. I'd say this is the most likely outcome. He basically loses the battle, but has enough ships and enough men to flee back to more friendly territory.
Once they were in the clear, Antony transferred to Cleopatra's flagship, and we are told that he refused to speak to her for 3 days.
Ooh.
According to Plutarch, he went forward to the prow and sat down by himself in silence.
I can see
holding
why
his
he'd
head
be
in his hands.
Why he'd be angry. Like I said, I understand what Cleopatra's thinking. I think she's looking out for her own interests and the interests of her kingdom, but she did basically screw Mark Antony there. There's a chance that by joining in on the battle, they could have achieved that best possible scenario of completely defeating Agrippa. I still think it wouldn't have happened, but that's what Mark Antony is going to be thinking, so I get why he'd be pretty pissed off.
We are never told whether this whole thing was a prearranged plan between Antony and Cleopatra.
I didn't even think of
if
that.
Cleopatra's flight had caught Antony by surprise. The fact that the Egyptian fleet had been held in reserve the whole time, with their sails assembled and ready to go, suggests that this was a prearranged plan.
Yeah, you know what? I can't believe I didn't think of that, but he's exactly right. I'm sure this was a prearranged plan from Cleopatra, but of course Mark Antony would also know, right? So suggesting either that he knew about this, maybe they didn't talk about it, he was just aware, or him and Cleopatra literally conspired to do this. I think it's probably one of those things that they were prepared for. Cleopatra and Antony were perhaps ready to flee, but it was more of a only if we have to type thing. Like, I imagine Antony really did want to fight this battle and defeat Agrippa. I don't think he would have fled under any circumstances, but I imagine Cleopatra saw how the battle was going, decided to flee, and that was sort of a cue to Antony. But we don't really know. It's very complicated. It could have been completely prearranged. He always planned to flee with Cleopatra, and he knew when she was going to go. It could have been that under certain circumstances they were going to flee, and she made the decision. He might have ordered it. Maybe he didn't know at all. there's a couple of different possibilities here.
But at the same time, the fact that Antony had to swim to another ship in order to make his escape suggests that it was not.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying I think it's some mix of planned and spontaneous. I think if Antony certainly knew about this, and they probably agreed under some circumstances they would flee, or maybe it was sort of an unspoken thing, and then it was Cleopatra who made the spontaneous decision to flee at that moment, and Antony had to follow along. That would be my best guess, but it could have been any of these options, really.
Why did Antony refuse to speak to Cleopatra for 3 days? Was it from a sense of humiliation, or was it from a sense of betrayal? I genuinely do not know.
Yeah.
You're free to make up your own mind.
Yeah. We really don't know. I've given my thoughts. I'd be curious to hear what exactly you guys think happened. We really don't know. We can't know. We don't have the sources. But, given the information we have, I'm curious what you guys think, what conclusion you come to.
But it wasn't all bad. Antony had gone into the Battle of Actium kind of hoping for a draw. And in the immediate aftermath, that's what it looked like.
Okay.
Both sides had lost a bunch of ships, but Antony had escaped with 1/3 of his fleet and 100% of his treasure.
I mean, this is the most likely outcome that I was talking about, which seems not necessarily great for Antony, but okay. It seems like a foundation from which he can continue to fight. I'm curious to see if it actually was more of a loss, because the way Historia Civilis framed it, initially it looked like a draw. That suggests it's probably going to get worse for our boy Mark Antony here.
And by his treasure, I mean Cleopatra's treasure. They had enough money to raise another army and continue the fight. Plus, they still had those 50,000 soldiers back at Actium, who were in the process of escaping to the east. From such a weak position going into Actium, this was basically a win. Except it wasn't. Back at Actium, when the rest of Antony's fleet figured out that Antony and Cleopatra were fleeing, something like 130 ships surrendered to Agrippa on the spot.
Of course, yeah. I literally talked about earlier in this episode how fighting, especially a civil war, is partially about PR. You have to appeal to the Roman people, the Roman politicians, but your own men as well. And if your men feel like you've abandoned them, well, it's not that much of a stretch to go over to Octavian or surrender. Now, if you're fighting against a foreign enemy, a good patriotic Roman will never want to surrender. He'll keep fighting till the end. But they're not fighting against a foreign enemy. They're fighting against Octavian, a true Roman. In fact, their guy, Mark Antony, is very much entangled with these foreign elements. So it's a lot easier for these men, particularly if they feel abandoned by Mark Antony, to then abandon him. I mean, a lot of these guys are only attached to Mark Antony and his cause by some sort of personal loyalty to Mark Antony himself. And if they feel like they've been betrayed and that's gone, that loyalty is gone, then a lot of them will have no issue, or much less of an issue, surrendering or deserting to Octavian than they would to a foreign enemy. So this is a very good point to make by Historia Civilis, and this really makes sense if you think about it.
On land, Antony's army of 50,000 did not flee to the east as instructed. They sent a message to Octavian. They wanted a deal. They told him that they would switch sides if he would agree to give them a share of the spoils from the battle that they had just technically been on the losing side of.
Interesting. And as you can see, a lot of these men are tied to Mark Antony by personal loyalty, but everyone looks out for themselves. That's just the way the world works. And so, left to their own devices, this army has decided, probably because they feel betrayed by Antony, probably because they would rather not continue fighting, and probably because they don't even know if they can make it back east without being defeated by Octavian again, they've decided that their best possible option is to stay in the position they're currently in and broker a deal with Octavian, which he's probably going to grant them.
Octavian agreed. And now, with the defection of the legions and the capture of so many of his ships, Antony's position was not so secure. Agrippa and Octavian found themselves with unrivaled naval superiority over the entire Mediterranean, and it wasn't even close. Antony still had 20,000 soldiers stationed in Libya, but by the time he arrived there, they had already heard about the fiasco at Actium, and
I'm very curious to see how this ends. I mean, I knew that Octavian would eventually beat Mark Antony. I mean, Octavian literally goes on to be emperor, but this seems extraordinarily quick, and it also seems like Mark Antony is basically done for. I don't know the specifics, so I'm very curious to see how this whole thing ends and what's going to happen.
They refused to follow his orders.
Wow.
If you're counting, that's 70,000 soldiers that Antony had lost not in battle, but to defection. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt empty-handed, with fewer options than they had imagined. The actual Battle of Actium may not have been decisive, but the aftermath certainly was.
I'm curious to see what they do, because at least the way Historia Civilis is presenting it, Antony basically seems done for. I'm not sure if he can find another option or what's going to happen.
Octavian and Agrippa were in no rush to push Antony. They had absolute naval superiority, and that wasn't going to change anytime soon. Octavian made contact with all of the Eastern monarchs and reassured them that their positions were secure and their relationship with Rome would not be changing. With these words, Octavian dismantled the donations of Alexandria and Antony's plan for a restructured Roman East.
And Octavian, Jesus, Historia Civilis just hinted at what it was. The donations of Alexandria was Mark Antony's plan to restructure the Roman East around Egypt. He was basically designing this Egypt-oriented Eastern Empire that was still in partnership with the Roman Empire. Rome was still at top, but there were all these different territories that Egypt would sort of control as client states and allies. It was a complicated restructuring, though Historia Civilis argued it would be better for administration and to maintain alliances. I think it was a little too complicated and also seemed quite foreign to your average Roman who just wanted Rome to control the territories, but that's what the donations of Alexandria were. And as we saw, Octavian just completely destroyed that. He reached out to all of Mark Antony's allies after taking a bunch of his men, or at least forcing a bunch of his men to surrender, and said to them, yeah, we're going to maintain your current relationship with Rome. And they said, well, okay, sounds good. So, honestly, Mark Antony's position has sort of been declining for a while, but he has just been stripped of a massive amount of his power.
Octavian also took this opportunity to discharge a lot of soldiers, everybody over a certain age.
Wow.
His financial obligations were immense. He didn't have the means to pay them right now, but with all of the incoming defections, he had no use for such a massive army anymore. Agrippa accompanied the soon-to-be discharged veterans back to Italy. Amid all of this turmoil, Armenia fell back into Parthia's sphere of influence. A decade of Antony's work had been undone.
And now it's completely undone. And with Armenia, if you guys remember, Antony had his totally failed invasion of Parthia, which he blamed on some sort of treachery from the Armenians, and he then invaded the relatively weak Armenian kingdom and defeated it. It was sort of a hollow win, but at this point, it was sort of his only win still on the board, and it's just fallen back to the Parthians.
In an instant, his Parthian campaign had been for nothing.
Jesus.
Agrippa wrote to Octavian from Italy. Discharging the veterans was not going well. Octavian still owed each of them farmland for their retirement, and he had no farmland to give them.
He's in a very similar predicament that his adoptive father was at one point. You know, when all the fighting is over, and I don't want to call it too soon, But clearly Octavian feels like the fighting is over. He's sending everybody home. Now you have to start paying up on your debts. First off, giving a certain amount of money to each of your soldiers, which I don't know if Octavian has, frankly. And perhaps even more problematically, granting farmland to all of your soldiers. Now, we've seen previously Octavian just seized farmland from Roman citizens and gave it to his soldiers. But now he's got a lot of farmland to grant, and I don't know what he's going to choose to do.
There was a growing consensus that Octavian was just stringing them along. There was now open talk of rebellion.
Uh-oh.
Octavian traveled to Rome to meet with the veterans. He told them that Egypt would fall within a year, and that after Egypt, he was done. After Egypt, he would fulfill all of his promises. There was a lot of grumbling, but after some negotiations, the veterans stood down. It's possible that Octavian offered to pay them a bonus or something.
Look, I mean, Octavian is not necessarily as good with his men as Caesar was, but we saw similar things from Caesar. His men grew frustrated at points and felt like they were being strung along, and Caesar had to come to them and say, look, it's almost over, and I'll give you what you're due at the end of this. This is a pretty common thing for someone in Octavian's position to have to do, and that's exactly what he did. Like I said, he may not have that connection with the men that Caesar did. Octavian's not a military man. He does not command that sort of military respect, but he can come to them and say, look, just like Caesar, this thing's almost over, and when it's done, I will give you all that you're due. And at least at the moment, that is enough to stop a rebellion, or at least postpone a rebellion.
Octavian spent the rest of the winter making preparations. In the spring, he departed Italy and led an army into the Roman East. The intervening time had made it clear that Antony's support was only growing weaker by the day.
Jeez.
The Egyptian campaign would not be difficult.
All right. I'm super excited to get to that one. Like I said, I know the broad strokes of a lot of Roman history, but particularly the Octavian-Antony Civil War, I do not know the details. Seems like Antony is basically screwed. He has a very weak base of support, and Octavian is still in a pretty powerful position. I'm very curious to see what happens next time. Of course, at the moment, this is the newest Historia Civilis video. This one was released in December, so this is a new one. So we will have to wait for the next video in this series. I will react to it as soon as it comes out, but in the meantime, I will continue to react to the other Historia Civilis videos. We're coming pretty close to the end, but I'm going through them all in chronological order. We've still got a couple of videos left that we haven't got to. So that's what we'll be doing next, and I will be waiting with bated breath for the next Octavian-focused video, because I really love these. They're fantastic. Historia Civilis does a great job, as always, right? As always. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon and channel memberships for exclusive reaction videos, including exclusive Historia Civilis reactions. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.